So just a short word about Scholarium. Scholarium is a grassroots nonprofit initiative that is addressing the erosion of the humanities in higher education. And we're trying to find ways to harness the knowledge and talent of a large population of PhDs and early career scholars in the humanities, and creating channels for them to engage the public outside the traditional university settings. So just a short introduction for Scott Chase. His research focuses on really on one of the most fascinating periods in the history, I would say, of any religion. That is that period where early Christianity, the Christian tradition is emerging. It's fascinating because it's this moment in time where you see a tradition that splits into two different traditions. You literally see a religion coming into being, so to speak. So it has fascinated scholars for centuries and decades, and just a really interesting period to look at. Scott is especially interested in the intersection of religious ideas and movements with geography and material culture, which explains his background in archaeology. He holds not one, but two master degrees, one in theological studies concentrating on biblical studies from Boston University, and he completed that in 2015. And then he went and did another master's degree in ancient Greek and Roman studies from Brandeis University in 2019, and after which he came to BU and started his PhD. He's participated in 5 seasons of excavations in northern Israel, including 3 with the Hellenistic Galilee Project. Scott is therefore uniquely positioned to speak about the community that gave rise to the Dead Sea Scrolls. So with no further ado, Scott, the stage, the screen is all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Yair and Ellis, and thank you everybody who's joining us tonight. I'm excited to talk to you guys about the Dead Sea Scrolls and to use the Dead Sea Scrolls to learn about the period of history that I study and am interested in, which is the Second Temple period of Judaism. I thought by way of introduction, I'd just give a brief overview of all 5 of the sessions. We're doing a 5-part series on the Dead Sea Scrolls here. And so we'll be spending our time tonight thinking about discovery, and thinking about what are the scrolls, what have we learned about the scrolls, how are they found, what do we learn from the scrolls, and a little bit about some of the controversies that have surrounded them since they were discovered in the Dead Sea region in 1947. Then next Tuesday, special day and time for the Thanksgiving holiday, we'll look at the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Bible. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, many of the scrolls that are found are biblical scrolls, but they teach us a great deal about what it means to have a Bible, how the Bible was put together. They are also by far the earliest witness that we have for any of the texts that we know today as the Bible by almost 1,000 years. And so it was a remarkable development in the field of the study of the Bible when these scrolls were discovered. And we'll look at the different ways that the Dead Sea community and other Second Temple communities looked at the Bible, how they used it, how they interpreted it, how they rewrote it for their own purposes, and what that tells us about how we should understand the Bible as we read it today. And then after the holiday, we'll look at the community that gave us the scrolls. As I mentioned, and as I will explain a great deal more this evening, it is a unique religious community within the larger orbit of Judaism of the Roman period that produced these scrolls for us and left them behind and left us really with the scrolls and a little bit of their material remains as the only trace of them. So we'll learn a lot about what we can know about that community and what it tells us about the way that people experienced Judaism in the first century of the Common Era. And then in our penultimate class, our 4th class, we will spend our time looking at some of the unique content of the scrolls. So scrolls that are not biblical scrolls, scrolls that are not known to us from our Bible, from Christian sources, from rabbinic Jewish sources, etc., but something just totally new genres of literature that we never really encountered before the scrolls were discovered. But they tell us a lot about what people are thinking about and what they're worried about in that time period, that very important time period of history. Things like fate and free will, things about what does it mean for there to be a revelation from God, things like what should we expect at the end of days, and then more mundane kind of things about the religion of the period as well. How did people pray? You know, what prayers do we have that survive down to the present day that people were already praying in the worship life, the synagogue life, and the temple life while the temple was still standing? And, you know, how do people view the world around them? You know, it turns out that they're very concerned with angels and demons and powers within the world. They live in a very, what we call an enchanted world, a world where nature and the environment are very serious business, and the spirits and powers are moving all around in the environment. And so that's an important part of their worldview. They imagine angels are there among them as well, as they pray, as they do their prayers, etc. The fifth week, the final week, we'll kind of wrap everything up by dealing with some of the legacy of the Dead Sea Scrolls that we've encountered in the 20th century, conspiracy theories, legends, fakes and forgeries, issues around the ownership of the scrolls, issues around cultural possession, and finally issues about what we should take away from the scrolls, how we should understand them in terms of contemporary Christianity, and how we should understand them in terms of contemporary Judaism. So that will kind of wrap up our program. So that's what we're going to do together. And as we go through it, we'll look at lots of scrolls, we'll look at lots of texts from scrolls, we'll look at lots of pictures, we'll look at lots of archaeology, and I hope to bring you kind of an interesting, very diverse view into this phenomenon. In terms of what we're going to talk about today, I've sort of structured this as a session in three parts. We'll talk a little bit about how the scrolls came to be lost to begin with, and the moment and time that they came to be lost. Then we'll pause from the kind of the historical narrative and just talk for a little bit about what is a Dead Sea Scroll, in terms of not only the very physical kind of nature of what is a Dead Sea Scroll, but also what's in them. And then I'll spend the remainder of our time together talking about the fascinating 1940s and 1950s through the 1980s story of finding the Dead Sea Scrolls, and end with the most recent discoveries. I have a little 2-minute movie from discoveries that were made around this time last year in New Cave that's brought us the first kind of textual scrolls since the 1950s. So just to situate ourselves in time, I want to give you a little bit of a thought experiment here. I want you to imagine that you are a part of a Jewish community that is living beside the Dead Sea in the southern part of Israel at the time of the war, the Jewish war with the Romans. And so the time period that we're talking about is about 70 of the Common Era. And in this particular community seems to be mostly a community of men, but it's a community that is involved with other communities that share like-minded ideas about Judaism in this time period, and is known to us through historical sources as one of the great kind of denominations or sects of Judaism in the Roman period. And they're called the Essenes. We'll explore them a little bit more. But in the year 70 CE, this community living beside the Dead Sea is in crisis. The war in Jerusalem has gone on for 2 years. The Roman forces have destroyed the city. They've just burnt the temple to the ground. And now the Roman army is moving towards insurgents who are remaining in the Herod's fortress at Masada, which has become the last stronghold of Jewish sovereignty and Jewish resistance to the Roman Empire. And we all know the story of Masada, that eventually the Romans will build a siege works and defeat the fortifications and conquer Masada, but not before the remaining rebels that are there take their own lives. And that's kind of a famous story for those who know that period of Jewish history. But this community is living in the immediate environs of that, only maybe 8 miles away. And they have a crisis of their own. Are they going to be part of this resistance, or are they going to surrender? What are they going to do? And so one of the things that we think that they did is to take their prized possessions, which are consist of hundreds of parchment scrolls containing everything from the Bible to the unique ideas and writings of the teachers of their community, and they hide them in the caves above their community along the shore of the Dead Sea. And then they go and they join the rebels to fight and die at Masada. That's at least kind of the theory of what happens here. And so what we have and what we will be exploring together is the remains that were left behind in that moment of resistance and rebellion in the year 70 of the Common Era. This is an artist's rendering, by the way, of what the community might have looked like based on archaeological remains. And there are pretty significant archaeological remains of the community that you can go visit today. I've been there myself a couple of times. So this just kind of tells the story that I just told. The community is maybe 50 to 100 people in strength, living a life of prayer, living a life of anticipation of the end of days. And so ultimately they believe that this war that's taking place is the war to end all wars, and they go and they join in the rebellion, and they never return. You know, they leave behind all their belongings, they leave behind the scrolls, and as far as we can tell, they never come back to retrieve any of them. And so that's how they come to be situated the way that they are found in 1947. I probably should say just a little bit about the Jewish War for those who are not familiar with what happened in the Jewish War that led to the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem in the 60s of the Common Era. But basically, for a period of time leading up to the 60s of the Common Era, the Jewish community in Jerusalem and the Roman authorities are increasingly at odds with one another. We already see this playing out in the time of Jesus, that is maybe 30 years previously. The gospel accounts and other accounts that we have of that time period, a few decades before the war, already suggest that there's tensions brewing that ultimately is going to lead to violence. But the immediate incident that leads to rebellion is a plundering of the temple treasury by the Roman governor, Florius. And at that time, the Jewish community from around the world, about half of the people who would consider themselves to have Jewish identity are living in the land of Israel, and about half scattered around wide portions of the Roman Empire, everywhere from Persia to Spain. There are Jewish communities living abroad, and they all bring their offerings, their financial offerings, to support the temple in Jerusalem 3 times a year. And so the treasury of the temple is one of the wealthiest places in the Roman world at the time that this is happening. And so it obviously, if you're an opportunistic military guy, that may be an attractive target for a robbery, and that's what takes place. That's an outrage that really unites Jewish communities that don't get along with each other. They don't agree on lots of different things. They don't agree on how the temple should be run. They don't agree on how Jewish law should, Jewish life should be lived, how Jewish law should be followed, whether different purity practices should be observed. They don't agree about the leadership of people like Jesus, or about this teacher of righteousness in the community of the Essenes that we'll learn about. So they don't agree about it, many things. But this act is like an act that's beyond the pale, and it unites pretty much all of the Jewish communities together in rebellion against Rome. Of course, the Romans are an overwhelming military force. They laid siege to the city, and they plunder it, and they carry off all that is remaining in the city to Rome, bringing thousands of individuals to Rome as slaves in tribute as well. The picture that you can see on the right-hand side of the screen here is from the Arch of Titus in Rome. And this is the Arch of Titus is there today. You can go see it still there, showing the in this case the menorah and other cult objects from the Jerusalem temple being carried away to Rome as tribute. And other historical sources that we have suggest that this wealth, this plunder, is used to finance the redevelopment of the Roman Forum and the Flavian Amphitheater, the building that we call the Colosseum, which again you can go see in Rome today. So the money seized from the Jerusalem temple and the plunder of Jerusalem is used to finance the redevelopment of Rome as a city. But the war doesn't end there. It continues in the north and in the Galilee and Golan regions, and then ultimately in the region south of Jerusalem around the Dead Sea, and takes us into the final defeat at Masada in the 73 of the Common Era. So this brings to an end what we call the Second Temple world. And so the Second Temple is the temple, the first temple was the temple built by Solomon on the Temple Mount, and it stood from the time of Solomon until the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem in the 500s BCE. But then when Jewish communities returned from exile in Babylon, they built the temple again, and it created, a very, especially in the Roman period, a very wealthy city-state around the temple complex that was, like I said before, supported by Jews from all over the world, from Asia Minor, from Egypt, from the further east regions of Persia and Iraq and modern-day Syria. After some politics and some military events that happened, the Jews ruled themselves for a while, for a little over 100 years. There's a dynasty called the Maccabean dynasty, and they control it as an independent country. But then that comes to an end right before the Common Era. The Romans install Herod first as a king, and then when Herod dies, they appoint a Roman governor in his place. The Roman world, the early Roman world in which they live is a pretty amazing world, though. It's a world in which technology is developing at a very rapid pace. Amazing technologies around moving water, around moving people, and around building things. These are all like dramatic developments, and so it leads to kind of a flourishing of life in the land of Israel and around the world as all these new technologies come into place. We have aqueducts in Jerusalem. We have, magnificent new buildings. We have amazing kind of new development and a big boom in population as well. So that's the Second Temple world. So in terms of the religion of the Second Temple world, the Judaism of the Second Temple world, there are some unique developments as well. So the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, has taken its final form at this point. People are already reading the 5 books of Moses more or less as we read them today. It turns out that the Dead Sea Scrolls will teach us that there are some differences between the Torah that they read and the Torah that we have today, but they're not major differences. They're differences of text more than they are differences of substance. the prophetic books, the major prophets and the 12 minor prophets, that is also kind of already taken shape. And so those two collections, the Torah and the prophets, are the teachings, the religious tradition that everybody shares in common in this time period. Other writings, like the Book of Esther, the Book of Daniel, are still taking shape in this time. The Book of Chronicles as well is also kind of still being developed during this Second Temple period, and so those books will ultimately end up in our Bibles, but they are still in development during this time period. The other thing is just to sort of to think about what people are thinking about in this time period, and they're very concerned about nationalism. They've lost nationhood in the aftermath of the Romans arriving on the scene. And so people have, and this is true of cultures across the Middle Eastern world, not just the Jews, but also the Idumeans and the Arabs and the Nabateans and all these, surrounding communities are all very, very nationalistic in this time. They also have a strong sense of nostalgia. People have a strong connection to the past, to the traditions of the past, and they imagine sort of an idealized life around something that they've lost in the modern age, their modern age. And that's, I think, a sentiment that we all can sort of sympathize with, that when we have these periods in history where there's a sudden rapid development in technology, in buildings, in ways of communication, in ways of travel, people get nostalgic for what the past was for them. And for the Jews of the first century, that past was the past of the earlier Israelite kingdom and the sort of the restoration of that kingdom in the Persian period.
Excuse me, Scott. I'm sorry, I can't find the hand thing.
That's okay.
So how do you know all this? I mean, it's one thing to find scrolls or to find artifacts, but you're talking about nationalism, nostalgia, religiosity. Those are concepts that I don't know how you discover in archaeology.
Thankfully, one of the things that we discover in archaeology is actually texts. And so some of what I'm proposing to you actually comes from internal readings of the scrolls themselves. And also the way that the scrolls help us to read the other histories that we already have available to us, which would include the New Testament, gives a kind of an early Christian view of that same time period. We also have historians like Josephus, who's a Jewish historian, who writes about this time period. And then we have Jewish philosophers like Philo, who also write in this time period. And we have Roman historians, Livy, Pliny, Plutarch, who also, they tell us everybody has a bias. So nobody is writing really history in the way that a modern historian strives to be very objective. But this is kind of the picture that everybody puts together from looking at all the sources that we have kind of read in light of each other. And so, yeah, I'm summarizing a little bit, but does that help answer the question? So we're kind of looking, this is kind of a broader view of the period that we take by reading all these different sources together. And then we look a little bit at the archaeology as well. But the archaeology, it's one of the rare time periods in history where the archaeology actually gives us texts. That's one of the amazing kind of discoveries of the scrolls. It's not too many times in history that we get like a whole library just handed to us in the way that we've had here. But since you brought up archaeology, we do have some archaeology of the religion as well, and we make some conclusions about the religious practices from the time period from the archaeology. I have two pictures on the right-hand side here. One is the top one is of stone vessels, stone cups and bowls, and that sort of thing. And we find these all over the regions where Jews practicing kind of proto-modern Judaism, proto-ancient Judaism are living. So we can look at the regions where they live, cities that we know that Jews lived in, we find these in. Cities that they don't live in, we really don't find these stone vessels in. And a lot of people, there's some evidence from the New Testament and other sources that suggest what these are used for. And we think that these are vessels that are showing us about how people are practicing dietary laws of purity. So because stone vessels, we know from later writings like the Mishnah, can be purified and after coming into contact with various impurities. So something that has been in contact with meat can then be used for non-meat and things that have been contaminated maybe by blood or something like that can be washed if they're a stone vessel. But if they're a ceramic vessel, a clay vessel, you're supposed to break them. So the prevalence of stone vessels in the early Roman period, we kind of use as evidence that Jewish communities are practicing a kind of form of dietary purity in their daily lives. So that's one example. The other example is mikvaot, ritual baths. They emerge on the scene in a big way in this early Roman period. So we find in almost every Jewish community in the land of Israel these ritual baths. We find them in private homes, and we find them in contexts where they're clearly meant to be used by the broader public as well. And we find lots of them in the community. So a small community like Magdala on the Sea of Galilee, which has been excavated just broadly in the last 25 years or so. There's dozens of these in private homes, in mansions, and then in the public square for people to use as well. And so we think people are following the laws of marital purity, the laws of conversion, and the laws of kind of corpse impurity, impurity associated with leprosy, those sorts of things, because they're using these ritual baths in that way. And they tell us in some of their texts that they do as well. So anyway, purity, ritual purity becomes a big part of daily life in these communities. And certain groups will take it to the extreme. So these groups, like the Qumran community that gives us the scrolls, is very focused on, they will bathe every day and they will only wear certain kinds of clothing. They're very focused on that. And then the other thing that the texts sort of give us, and the texts all sort of agree, the historians, the New Testament, the scrolls, all sort of agree about big theological issues that people are concerned with as well. They're concerned about what happens when you die. It's funny, but in the earlier periods of Jewish history, people don't really seem to be super concerned about what happens after you die. They can sort of just believe that you go down into the pit and maybe in a sort of an underworld or something like that. They're not really super focused on that. The Hebrew Bible, the biblical canon, isn't really focused on that, but people will suddenly become very concerned about that in the Roman period. People will become concerned about fate. They live in a world where they believe that there are omens in the heavens. They believe that there are angels and demons all around them. So they're very concerned about fate. They're very concerned about the kind of the animated world around them. And then they're very concerned about what's going to happen next. So is the world going to come to an end? Are we going to enter into some kind of different age that's different from the present age? Are we going to finally throw off the yoke of imperialism and live as free people? Or, or maybe the whole world is going to be destroyed and recreated. So these are really kind of the things that they are very, very focused on. And we see this all over the scrolls and all over the other texts from the time period. So that's kind of their religious world, is focus in a day-to-day, living out these practices of purity, and then thinking about these big questions about life after death, angels and demons, and how the world works, trying to figure it all out. I should say a little bit about the different groups, just because I will mention them at various times during the next couple of weeks. We're going to be very focused on this group called the Essenes. The Essenes, where most scholars believe, are the community that gave us the scrolls. and I'll say something a little bit about them in just a second because I've spent a lot of time on the Essenes. But just to talk about some of the other groups that we know about historically from this time period, there seems to be this group called the Sadducees, that we kind of use the New Testament names for these groups in English, but the Sadducees, or Sadokim in Hebrew, are righteous ones, is the kind of the name that they put upon themselves. These are the community that seems to be in control of the temple, and so they are very focused on living the Israelite religion of animal sacrifice, and practicing the various devotions to God that are carried out in the worship of the temple every day. They maintain the temple. The priests are mostly Sadducees, and they don't focus as much on the daily life purity rituals that we hear about from other groups. And they're also not really focused on these questions of fate and free will or life after death. In fact, both Josephus and the New Testament will tell us that the Sadducees don't believe in a resurrection. So they don't believe that there's any life after death. The Pharisees are probably the most important group of the time period in terms of understanding what will become Judaism in all later periods. So what we think of as rabbinic Judaism in the late Roman, early medieval, and into the modern times is all directly descended from this group called the Pharisees. And this is the community that has the rabbis. They're very focused on observing the law and living the law in their daily lives and living a moral life. So moral life issues like character, issues like virtue, issues like right and wrong are very central to the thinking of the Pharisees. At the same time, they are also trying to be very observant in the ritual practices of Judaism. And that means keeping the dietary laws. It means keeping the marital and family purity laws. It means keeping the festivals. It means maintaining kind of a Jewish home and an environment around the Sabbath and those sorts of things. That all is kind of the orbit of the Pharisees. They're also like super focused on fate and free will. They're fatalists. They believe that God is in control and kind of determines all things. Is a key part of their ideology as well. A third group that we have in the period that we don't really know very much about is this group that we call the Zealots. And the Zealots seem to be believe in more of a political Judaism. These are probably people that have connections to that Maccabean, Hasmonean kind of state apparatus of Judaism, and they want Jewish rule and autonomy over and against the Roman Empire. And they're not afraid to use various violent means to do that. There's a subgroup of the Zealots that are called Sicarii that carry out assassinations. They'll go in the festivals and they'll just assassinate leaders in hopes of sparking a revolt and that sort of thing. And so we know a lot of the Zealots are kind of always leading a rebellion. They'll have a rebellion in Sepphoris, and then they'll have a rebellion in Jerusalem. They kind of just move around and have a kind of a violent orientation to them, while they want to restore a political kingdom of Jewish control. Then kind of on the right-hand side, we have these two movements that I would class as spiritual movements. So these are groups that are reading the Bible kind of in a different way. They're reading allegorically. So they're imagining that they're not wanting to restore a political kingdom or restore the old temple apparatus. They're imagining kind of a new age, a messianic age is going to come, in which people are going to live a life of purity, a life free of outside corruption, a life of kind of direct connection with God and angels. But the Essenes and the Jesus movement take on very different forms. The Jesus movement emerges around a leader, Jesus, a rabbi who is teaching his own ideas and builds a following. We all kind of all know the story of early Christianity, but Jesus is killed. His followers interpret his resurrection as potentially a sign that the golden age is coming, and they go out and carry that message out into the broader Roman Empire, and that becomes Christianity at a later date. The Essene community seems to be more of a book-learned community that is very focused on reading the Bible and prayer and practicing their unique rituals and observing like a very almost like a monastic way of life, but at the same time also very focused on an end times. And that's the community that we learn about, and the community that we think we get the scrolls from. And I will say why we think that at some point. It is not 100% certain, but at the same time, there's very, very, very compelling evidence to suggest that these communities are one and the same. This is a quote. I won't read the whole quote from Josephus's history. Actually, from Josephus's book on the Jewish War, that tells kind of the various philosophies or the various philosophical groups within Judaism. And this is kind of Josephus's description of these people called the Essenes that will give us the scrolls. And he says, they are, even more mutually affectionate towards one another than the other Jewish groups, but they shun all pleasures as vice, and they exercise extreme kind of forms of self-control. They disdain marriage. Instead, they adopt children of outsiders, and they separate themselves from the way of women. I assume that means that they separate themselves from having kind of marriages and children in the way that other Jewish communities, even including the Jesus movement, all do. And they are totally convinced that everybody is kind of lost without this a very kind of extreme way of faithfulness that they are trying to live out. So that's what a Roman historian tells us about this community. Another Roman historian, this one is Pliny, is not Jewish. He's a pagan Roman from Rome, who happens to write a history of the world and an encyclopedia of the world at exactly the moment where all this is happening. So I think he writes in like the year 57, he puts his encyclopedia of the world together. And so the Essenes are right there living in Qumran, this community on the Dead Sea, for us to find right at the moment, right before their destruction. And so when I say we think that the community of Essenes is the community that gives us the scrolls, one of the things that we rely very heavily on is the evidence of this historian, who's, like I said, is from another part of the world, has nothing invested in this project of a kind of a new kind of Judaism. But he just tells us about this group, but he tells us exactly where they're living. They're living just north of En-Gedi, on the northern shore of the Dead Sea, but just a little bit away from it, close enough to it to see it, but far enough away that you can't like smell the poisonous fumes of the Dead Sea. And he also describes them as a people that renounce sexual desire and money. They have only palm trees to keep them company, and they are kind of refugees from the rest of the world. But it really is because Pliny gives us this very precise location that we think it's this particular community that gives us the scrolls. And it's, I don't know how much you've traveled around the region of the Dead Sea. It doesn't really support a lot, like it doesn't support big communities. There's not a lot of water. There's not a lot of opportunities for agriculture. There's not a lot of opportunities to like do any kind of commerce. So like, it doesn't have any goods you can sell. And so there's not really a lot of people living there. And so when we find a community that looks like a monastery, that looks that, including with a cemetery and these sorts of things, and it's exactly where this historian tells us, we kind of have to put 2 and 2 together and conclude that this community is the community that is described in the history books. And I say all that just because there are scholars that dispute that. And the reason that they dispute that is people wonder, like, how could this group of, like, strange people that are living kind of at the edge of civilization produce all this amazing literature and all these manuscripts and all these stories, and have this whole life going on in this very kind of marginal place in the world. That's the objection that they raise. But for me personally, and for many historians, we kind of take the historical view here that it pretty much has to be this community, because there just ain't a whole lot else out there that this could be. This, like, just one town with this one configuration that has been found archaeologically. So anyway, that's why we think the Essene community, this kind of community of renunciants, people who are living a life free of distractions and very focused on living in a pure relationship with God and angels, is also the people that gives us the scrolls. Now, it turns out when we read the scrolls, that's also exactly what the scrolls tell us as well. So very, very, very strong case that this is the community that gives us the scrolls.
So Scott,
Yeah,
sorry to interrupt. Just want to clarify, are you saying that this is the group that wrote the scrolls, or that they just collected them, or
they are definitely the group that collected them.
Okay.
And the controversy is more about who wrote them. So I don't have a whole lot about producing scrolls in this particular presentation, but so when we look at a scroll, we have to think about it a couple of different ways, right? So there's, what is the text contained in it? If the text contained in the scroll is the book of Exodus, right? Nobody believes that this community wrote the book of Exodus, right? Well, maybe somebody does, but I don't think most scholars would think that because we found a manuscript of Exodus or we found a manuscript of Ruth, that those stories came about as a result of that. The same is true of some other biblical, non-biblical texts that we know about from the time period that we find at Qumran, but we don't think that they wrote them. So the book of Jubilees, for instance, is known in Christian circles as well, or the book of Enoch is widely known in the Second Temple period, not in the Bible, but we don't think that they wrote them. But then we have another category of literature that is like what we call community rules. And this is like, I'll show community rules when we get to the third session, but rules for like how you're supposed to organize your community. You're supposed to have, at age 16, the men make a profession of faith and they study for 2 years. And then at age 20, they are allowed to go out and find a wife. At age 60, they take the best seats in the synagogue. This kind of rules seem to be very, very oriented towards a particular community. I think more scholars would believe that they wrote those, that those were written for this community. And then there's another category of literature, which is like interpretation of the Bible, like how they read the Bible. And, maybe they read the prophetic book of Habakkuk, but they're interpreting it to be about a war between a wicked priest and a good priest, which isn't in Habakkuk at all. We also think that they wrote those kinds of texts as well. So when we have a scroll, it's like who authored it, who inscribed it, like who wrote the glyphs on the paper, the letters on the paper, and then who put it in the cave. Those can potentially each be different groups. So it's a little bit messy to parse out, and I realize maybe in the way that I've presented this, I've been a little bit ambiguous, but it's a potential, depending on the scroll, for it to be any of those things. But they're definitely, in my opinion, the people who deposited the scrolls, and in many cases they are they are the people that wrote the scrolls out by hand. And in many cases still, they're also the authors. So they potentially can be all three of those things. This map just shows where Qumran is located. And so it's at the top of the Dead Sea here on the west bank of the Dead Sea, directly east of Jerusalem. And then it just a map of in the overall region today, it would be about here in the modern day country of Israel. And this is just a picture of partially reconstructed remains of the site at Qumran, the monastery at Qumran. And you can see the Dead Sea in the foreground and the Jordanian side of the Dead Sea off in the distance there. So they are very close to the sea, but a little bit back from it. And in terms of the caves are where the scrolls are actually found. And I'll talk about the finds in just a moment. Some of the caves are literally at the site. Like you have to go through the archaeological site that we think was the Essene community in order to get to the caves. This cave right here is one cave in which it's hard to see. Maybe I have a better picture in a second. Is one cave where the scrolls are found. This one over here is another cave. And then there are more along the whole ridge line going up even as far as maybe 11 miles north. There are scrolls found. A couple more details about Qumran real quick. Like I said, archaeologically, we also know the site was destroyed during the Jewish War. We have a cemetery. The cemetery is almost all men between the ages of maybe 30 and 70 years old who are buried there. Again, so like more like we would think of a celibate community of men than anything else. And scholars have surmised that this is sort of the headquarters of this community. The community is represented in other places as well. And this is just another picture, another map for you showing some of the other caves. The closest is only 200 meters from the site. The furthest is about 4 kilometers away from the site. But they are all found in this region that is basically under the control of this site. There aren't other settlements or other communities in this area of the Dead Sea. And so pretty much all of this is within the orbit of this particular community. Within the caves themselves, pottery, leather goods, and even human remains archaeologically dated to the Second Temple period are also found. So I'll say I have about half an hour left. Is that correct? Yeah. So I'll say just for a couple of minutes, what are the scrolls? And we'll spend, like I said, the next 4 time periods together talking about what the scrolls are. But when we say what is a scroll, I think most folks are probably familiar with a Torah scroll as we might encounter it in the synagogue today. It's a rolled up document where pages have been stitched together, sheets of parchment or paper or vellum, leathery material, have been sewn together to make a surface onto which a long text can be written. And so when we talk about the scrolls, almost all the material that we find is of that physical form. It's oftentimes been broken down into just fragments, but we think that in almost every case, with only limited exceptions, the material was originally stitched together scrolls. We have fragments, scholars think, on the basis of writing and material evidence, potentially as many as 950 different manuscripts. So 950 different rolled up scrolls. Not just 900, there's thousands, tens of thousands of fragments of the scrolls. They are almost all written in Hebrew. There are a handful of exceptions to that. That's interesting in and of itself because Hebrew is not the spoken language in this time period. People speak Aramaic and Greek as their languages. It's actually a bilingual part of the world where people speak both Aramaic and Greek on a daily basis, as you might encounter other bilingual parts of the world. Everybody spoke some Aramaic and everybody spoke some Greek. Most people, it was one language was their primary language and the other was their secondary language. The other thing that we should say is these are not the handiwork of just sort of random people who made writings. These are some of the highest quality manuscripts of any kind that we have from the ancient and even early medieval world. So this is very, 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 very high quality archival quality writing, that the materials that are used are prepared very well. The leather, the paper, the ink, and then the actual hand in which it's written is a professional, well-trained hand of somebody who does these things for a living. So that's some of the material character of the scrolls. The other thing that unites the scrolls with the site of Qumran is this archaeological conjecture, but it's a strong conjecture of a place called the scriptorium, or like a writing center within the monastery of Qumran itself. So I have an artist's depiction of it on the left-hand side here, but it's an artist depiction that's based on the ruins. And so it's hypothesized that the second floor of this building was a place where the various activities of writing the scrolls took place. On the left-hand side of the cutaway picture, you can see a library where the scrolls are stored horizontally in these shelves. We actually do have one library that we have discovered in the ancient Roman world. It's in Pompeii, where scrolls are actually stored this way. And so it totally makes sense based on the one ancient library that remains to this day, that this was how these things would have been stored and accessed in their daily life. On the right-hand side of the cutaway picture, we can see men of the community engaged in the various practices of preparing to make the scrolls. So we can see people seated with scrolls in front of them and pens and ink pots writing. We can see people working on long tables to stitch the scrolls together. And we can see the gentleman in the foreground there, maybe rolling out the leather to make it smooth. So all of these activities of actually manufacturing the scrolls are taking place in this scriptorium, this scroll factory that's on site. One other really interesting fact, it's interesting to me anyway, I once wrote a paper about it. We found at this site at Qumran inkwells that contained the ink that the scrolls were written with. And actually half of all the ink pots that we know from the ancient world, there's like 14 total that have ever been found. 7 of them were found inside this building. So definitely a place where like lots of production of written materials is taking place. Over on the right-hand side of the screen here, we can see the way that they're stored. And they're stored in a purpose-made ceramic jar. These are not like jars for storing water or grain or anything else really. The way that you would store scrolls to keep them safe is you roll them up, you put them into the ceramic jar, you put the lid on the ceramic jar, and the lid is probably sealed with wax to keep it airtight. The environment around the Dead Sea receives so little rain and is so dry for so much of the year that really is enough to preserve it for all time. And that's why these writings survive to us in a way that writings from the city of Rome or the city of Alexandria or the city of Pergamon, these great, great cities with vast libraries in them, nothing written down really other than some scraps here and there survive. But this is a place that is so super dry and so conducive to permanent preservation that we get the written texts basically preserved down to the present day. Like more harm is coming to them from air conditioning now than they suffered during the entirety of their 2,000 years in a cave. So what is on the scrolls? Well, they're broken up into a couple of different genres. Roughly 25 to 30% of them are biblical manuscripts that correspond to the Hebrew Bible that we know today. The Hebrew Bible, like the Bible, like the Jewish Bible, if you have a JPS, or if you read the Tanakh in Hebrew, this is kind of very, very similar to the Bible that you have today. Nothing from the Christian Bible is found in any manuscript at Qumran. So it does not appear that it's a New Testament community, a Christian community, or that they had any form of the Christian writings that we know from the New Testament and other Christian sources, even sources that Christian writers talk about that were lost or anything like that. We don't have anything from there. So when we talk about biblical manuscripts, we're really talking about the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew. Every book except the book of Esther is represented. We don't know if they didn't like Esther, or if we just, that maybe the one copy of Esther got eaten or something, so there's lots of conjecture about that, but we really can't read anything else. We have at least 2 copies, not even just 1 copy, of every other biblical book. And then there's some biblical books like Deuteronomy and Isaiah that we have many, and Psalms. We have many copies, 30 plus copies of those scrolls found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. 15 to 20% are other writings that we know about from Second Temple Judaism, but are not in the Bible. So the book of Enoch, an apocalyptic book that's very popular among all the Jewish communities, the Pharisees reference the book of Enoch, the Mishnah references the book of Enoch, the New Testament writers talk about, they reference the book of Enoch. That's a writing that they know and comes down to us the present day in its Ethiopian form. That's found in Hebrew at Qumran in many copies as well. So we have those kinds of books. And then roughly 50% of everything is stuff that we've never seen before, that is unique to the community, but it represents a whole bunch of different genres that we'll be exploring in the time that we have together next week. These include what we call Rewritten Bible. So where they've taken a portion of the Bible, let's say a story from Genesis or a story from First Kings or something like that. They've taken a small snippet and they've written a whole big story to replace it. So, what happened, with Noah while he was on the ark? There's an extended story about that. Or what happened to Abraham during the time that he was arguing with God about Lot, about Sodom and Gomorrah. So they take these stories and they stretch them out to be a kind of a new Bible that has many additional stories, many additional versions of the stories that we know. Then we have their community rules, as I already mentioned, like the rules for how they live in their community. And it tells us a lot about who they are from the rules that we have from their community. And then we also have a lot of their interpretation of the Bible. So they have commentary. Somebody had asked about Midrash. They have a genre which we call pesher, their interpretation of individual lines of scripture for a lot of different biblical books. So they have it on Isaiah, they have it on Deuteronomy, they have it on Genesis, they have it on various minor prophets and Micah and Habakkuk and things like that. So we have that kind of interpretive text. And then we have these unique compositions as well. So, stories about wars that happen at the end of time, stories about things that happen in heaven. So we have all different kinds of literature that we'll explore the whole rich tapestry of that in a later session. And then we have some really crazy stuff as well. Some more mundane things like deeds, for the sale of property. But then we have like treasure maps written on copper. I'll spend some time talking about the copper scroll because it's one of the most interesting things that has ever been found in archaeology, never mind at Qumran. Just to sum up on why the scrolls matter before we kind of dive into the fine stories. One thing that, one reason they matter is they are by far the earliest manuscripts that we have of any and all of the divisions of the Bible. The earliest manuscripts we have of the Torah, the earliest manuscripts that we have of the prophets, the earliest manuscripts that we have of the various writings. So we, in some cases, they're 1,000 years older than the earliest written manuscripts that we have from the Aleppo Codex or the Damascus Codex, these other kind of very, very early Bibles that we have that are from the early medieval period. Then we also get, a second thing that we get is Hebrew and Aramaic versions of these other writings that we only knew about from later Christian interpretation. So books like Jubilees or books like Enoch, we know about them from early Christian writers, but they were otherwise lost. So we have new forms of those books, and they're probably much closer to the way that people in the Roman world read them. And then finally, as I said, we have this rich window into the whole religious life of the Second Temple period, not just of this group, but by comparison with all the other groups as well, how they think about purity, how they think about dietary laws, how they think about the Sabbath, how they think about festivals. And so it tells us about the whole context that gives birth to rabbinic Judaism as we'll experience it in later centuries after the Mishnah and the Tosefta and the Talmud. So that is why we care about the scrolls, and I'll come into that much more as time goes on. But I want to end our time together by just talking about the find, because the find in itself is a really fascinating story. These two men here, Bedouin men from the Dead Sea region. The gentleman on the left, his name is Muhammad al-Dib. He is actually credited with the finding of the scrolls. This is a picture of them later in life, but they've actually found these when they were very young men. But I'll tell the story as they tell it. So the story that gets narrated, and we have reasons to believe parts of it and reasons to doubt maybe some parts of it. But it goes like this. We're in 1947, so the last years of mandatory Palestine before the declaration of the State of Israel. A young man named Muhammad is minding some goats, a herd of goats that he's grazing in the kind of the arid part of the Dead Sea region. And the goats, if you've ever seen goats, they'll go right up a cliff. And so the goats got away. One of them got away, and he chased after it up the cliff as best he could. The goat came near to a cave. He throws a rock into the cave. I don't know if the story changes, maybe to scare the goat out, or maybe because little boys just like to throw rocks. He throws it into the cave, and he hears something break. And so he goes into the cave, and he finds, initially he gets frightened and he runs away. He comes back with his cousin. They go in and they find these clay jars. And initially they don't even know what's in the jars. So they take the lids off the jars. The jars have a smell. They get grossed out a little bit, but then they become more and more curious about them. And so in the process of finding some that are in a little bit better preservation, they unroll them and they realize that they have some kind of a text. But these boys, they're simple shepherd boys. They don't even read Arabic, never mind ancient Hebrew manuscripts. They don't even know what the letters are or anything like that. And so they keep some of them for a time, but they don't really know what to do about them. Eventually, somebody gets it in their mind that they might be valuable, and so they take them down to Bethlehem. Again, there is not at this time the partition between Jordan and Palestine, so you can move freely throughout this whole region. They take them to a man named Kondo. Kondo has a shop near the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem where he sells souvenirs to Christian tourists. And they want to see, they know Kondo from one way or another, and they want to see, hey, Kondo, do you know what they are? And he pays them $4 for the scrolls. Kondo thinks he has something, but he doesn't know what. So he goes, he talks to a friend who's a Christian. Kondo is a Muslim. He talks to a friend who is a Christian. His friend takes him to the Bishop Athanasius at the Church of St. Mark near the Jaffa Gate in the Old City. And Bishop Athanasius, he has a big library in his church, and so he knows a little bit about these ancient manuscripts, but this isn't something he recognizes. And so he gets a hold of kind of the chief archaeologist, an American archaeologist in the area, a guy named John Trevor from Harvard University, who is the president of the American Schools of Oriental Research in Jerusalem. And he gives them the scrolls. And Trevor is the one that recognizes that there's potentially previously undiscovered ancient Jewish manuscripts here. Trevor can read them a little bit. Bottom line, he brings them, or he sends photographs back here to Boston to William F. Albright, who's head of the Oriental Institute at Harvard University. Albright is a phenomenal biblical scholar who can read anything, And Albright immediately recognized them as potentially the most significant archaeological find since the discovery of King Tut's tomb earlier in the century. So that's kind of how the scholarly world learns about the scrolls, is through this process of increasing awareness that somebody has something really special on their hands. At the same time, Hebrew University Bible scholar by the name of Eliezer Sukenik also hears that there are scrolls, and so he sneaks across the British partition line into Bethlehem, and he asks to see the scrolls, and he buys what Kondo has. And this is a quote from Sukenik at the bottom here. And there's always, archaeologists always have this, like, you know, amazing moments that they like to narrate when they discover these things. And this is, Sukenik describes his gazing for the first time on a scroll that had not been maybe read in 2,000 years. And it always sort of elevates the archaeologist or the scholar to some, you know, special level of privilege that he can read the text when others can't. But this is the story that Sukenik tells for us. But 1947, 1948 is a difficult year in this part of the world. There's already revolution fomenting in both the Arab and Jewish communities in Palestine. The UN is desperately trying to put together a partition plan that is satisfactory to all parties. Of course, we know that the UN partition plan that doesn't ultimately become realized, and instead the Jewish community in Palestine declares the state of Israel in 1948 and take control over a part of the territory. But the part of the territory that they take control over does not include this Dead Sea region that ends up in the territory set aside for an Arab community that is then the king of Jordan, the Hashemite king of Jordan, gains control of that region in the aftermath of the events of 1948. So now we have potentially ancient Judaism find of the century, maybe find of the millennium, laying in territory belonging to the king of Jordan, who has less interest in these things than in other things that are going on in the world at this time. So a difficult year to have it be the year of the find. Meanwhile, you know, interest continues on the Israeli side. Mar Samuel, the bishop in this church in Jerusalem, he is struggling for money. Things are getting tight in Jerusalem. The communities, you know, geopolitical events are not what they were 10 years ago. And he feels it's best to get the scrolls out of the land of Israel and into the United States. And he runs an advertisement in the Wall Street Journal, putting them up for sale. And they are bought by a man named Yigal Yadin, who is chief of staff of the Israel Defense Forces, and Eliezer Sukenik's son, also a trained biblical scholar and archaeologist of some repute and some notoriety. Yadin is also known for kind of pillaging some things as well, as much as he does real archaeology. So he kept a lot of things for himself. But he's a colorful and iconic character in early modern Israeli archaeology, Yigal Yadin. He comes on this secret mission to Washington, D.C., and he buys this Dead Sea Scrolls from Mar Samuel in the lobby of a hotel. Modern historians of this event think the whole thing might have been a ruse, that this was set up as an excuse to allow the state of Israel to acquire the scrolls from the Arab community, who desperately wanted to sell them, but felt that because of geopolitical reasons at the time could not enact the sale, and that maybe even the CIA and MI6 and all these, you know, nefarious parties, may have been Mossad, may have been involved in orchestrating this ruse of allowing the scrolls to come to the United States and be sold. I think that is a story that needs to be told as well, but the details of that are very, very murky. In the meantime, on the Jordanian side, like I said, Jordan controls this region in the 1950s. They have a French and American team led by the Jesuit archaeologist Roland Deveau, go and excavate the caves. And in the process of excavating the caves, they find dozens and dozens of intact scrolls and thousands of fragments. And so they set up shop in what is now known as the Rockefeller Museum, then known as the Palestine, I think the Palestine Exploration Museum, in just north of the old city of Jerusalem, is under Jordanian control. They set up shop in that museum, and they work to piece together all these scrolls over a long period of time. But for various reasons, as scholars sometimes do, they keep all this research to themselves, and they don't really allow anybody else in to see what they're doing. And all kinds of conspiracy theories emerge from this, both later on tonight, if I have time, and as we get into the last session when we talk about conspiracies, I'll talk about how all these crazy ideas emerge just from Devoe's secrecy as a scholar. Like, he keeps things to himself, and people begin to think all kinds of unusual and kind of nonsensical things as a result. As the Jordanians continue to control the area in the 1960s, there are a series of sponsored excavations. And like I said, a workshop that's set up to piece these scrolls together in the Rockefeller Museum. Everything changes in 1967. We have the outbreak of sort of pan-Arab Israeli hostilities. Jordan, unwisely declares war on Israel late in those hostilities. Israel quickly overruns the Jordanian army and takes full control of the region that we now call the West Bank, and the territory that is Qumran represents, as well as the Rockefeller Museum itself, end up in the control of the modern day state of Israel. And so not to lose the opportunity to continue their private enterprise in working on the scrolls, the 8-person team led by Deveau transfers their allegiance and their patronage and the control of the scrolls to the Israelis. And they continue to work in the Rockefeller Museum, and then eventually they're set up shop in the new Israel Museum. But their team continues to kind of put things together throughout the 1970s and 1980s. In the meantime, some of the scrolls have been published in America and in Israel, and the scholarly community is starting to ask, what's going on with these things? And so as the 80s march on, increasing pressure mounts for Deveau to make the contents of the scrolls available. There is tantalizing clues about there's all these new biblical texts, or there's all these new interpretations, or there's all these new community rules, etc., but nobody really knows what the texts are. This is just a picture of them unraveling a scroll here with a pair of tweezers and screwdrivers. So while this is happening, for safety and archival purposes, photographic plates of the scrolls are being shipped to a library in the United States. And eventually, Herschel Shanks, the editor of Biblical Archaeology Review, discovers, wait a second, I don't have to publish the scrolls. I can just publish the photographs. And that's exactly what he does. And so he obtains access to the original high-resolution photographs of the scrolls, and they are published as a complete collection in the 1980s under the auspices of Biblical Archaeology Review magazine. And that's what makes the Dead Sea Scrolls as texts available to the scholarly community of today. But just in the meantime, changes have also happened in the Catholic Church. We've had the Vatican II reforms and a kind of an opening of the Vatican archives, all happening at the same time, as other conspiracy, new kind of 1970s, 1980s conspiratorial mindset emerges. And so the unraveling, the revealing of the scrolls, cannot be disconnected from all of the conspiracy theories that emerge in the 1970s and 1980s, everything from aliens and the pyramids to Mary Magdalene to the secret Vatican archives, all kind of gets wrapped up in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And so if you watch a Travel Channel or Discovery Channel documentary today, you will about the Dead Sea Scrolls, you're more often than not, you will encounter a mix of genuine scholarship and this sort of conspiratorial thinking. And like I said, in the last period, I'll come to only when we've learned what the scrolls really are, talk about some of those conspiracies. So just to sum up what the scrolls are today, as I mentioned before, roughly 950 manuscripts, 15,000 individual fragments. Almost all of them reside in a purpose-built museum called the Shrine of the Book inside the Israel Museum, where they change out the exhibits from time to time. What's usually in that big circular exhibit that you can see in the center there is the Isaiah scroll. But you can, as a museum visitor, you can pay your $10 or whatever, and you can go and explore the scrolls as well. They do make trips around the world to various museums. Some are in the Museum of the Bible right now in Washington, D.C. on loan. In maybe 2011, 2012 timeframe, they came to the Museum of Science in Boston. There were 59 scrolls that were on exhibit in Boston for pretty much all of, I think, 2011. They were there for you to see if you went to the exhibit there. The Jordanians do still maintain the things that they had happened to take to Amman before the 6-Day War. And those include the most fascinating scroll, the Copper Scroll. It lives in the National Museum in Amman. New technologies are emerging with computer artificial intelligence and high resolution X-ray spectroscopy to allow us to read the scrolls in new ways. So maybe stuff that was smudged or completely charred or completely carbonized from age can now be, maybe letters can be made out on it via X-ray. At the same time, non-invasive techniques for dating the scrolls have also emerged. Non-invasive techniques for discovering the chemical composition of the scrolls have emerged. So there's still a great deal of modern technology as well. We're right at time. Did you want to chime in on that, or?
I'm thinking that maybe we can save this video for next time, and if there's something like 5 minutes for questions. I know we're out of time. It's 8:30, and Ellis wanted to conclude promptly at 8:30. Gail is raising her hand.
Yeah, thank you. This is so interesting. I really appreciate this. Just wondering if there's anything, and you could even come back next week with this, but anything in particular that you would suggest reading to, get more information, more background about this? Do you have any favorite works?
I actually, I'll have to do this at the beginning of next time. I have many of my favorite works I brought with me. I would, if I had a little bit more time, I would talk about them. This book, which is by Philip Davies, that I bought, I actually bought this in the museum exhibit at the Museum of Science when it was here. It's called The Complete World of the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you want to read the texts of the scrolls, there's a couple of different translations. This one by Geza Vermesh is the one that everybody, this is the most complete one. It's also really readable. And so this has everything, if you want to read the war scroll, or if you want to read various Psalms about the apocalypse, or all the various hundreds and hundreds of different texts that have been found. This book by Vermesh is a good one. This one by Florentio Martinez is another good copy of the scrolls.
Aaron has the question, and Aaron, you're muted, so go. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, two questions related. Early on in the presentation, you said the Essenes all went off to fight with the Maccabees in Masada, I believe.
Yeah. Well,
how do you know that?
Well, we don't know that they all did. We do know that they are not. They do disappear. They leave and they don't come back. But what the most interesting things that I glossed over this because it's not good for an intro, but it is definitely fascinating evidence. We have fragments of the scrolls in the same manuscript hand as the materials found at Qumran in caves all the way to Masada and at Masada. So we
Okay.
actually have archaeologically in the ruins of the Herodian palace at Masada, we have fragments that are written in the same handwriting that are of some of the same text. So they leave a little trail, like, you know, when like Hansel and Gretel go through the forest and they leave the breadcrumbs behind, they leave breadcrumbs all the way to Masada and in Masada itself.
But you do know they disappeared all at once rather than the community died out because it was celibate.
Yeah, there's no evidence that they returned to the site. There are no burials at the site after 67. The burials have been investigated. I saw a presentation at ASOR in 2017 on the burials. They've all been carbon dated now. There's no burials after the Jewish war. So whoever was not at the site anymore does not return and live at the site subsequent to that, or at least there's no remains there of them.
Last related question. From all the stuff that you've read so far, were there any names of people who lived in that community?
You know, there are some names. Actually, one of them, I talked about these other weird things that are discovered. One of the things that I wrote about in my master's thesis was a deed of manumission of a slave. And that deed, which is on a potsherd, it's not on a scroll, but it's found with the scrolls. That deed actually does have the names of people. I don't remember exactly. I believe the man who owned the slave, his name was Yohanan. And I believe the slave himself was named Honi, Honi, which is not a Jewish name. So I think he was a non-Jewish slave that was owned by a Jewish man who was manumitted. And the community, they have a unique name for they call themselves the Yahad, like the togetherness, like the all as one is like their unique name for the community. The Yahad is mentioned in the deed. So yeah, so it appears that there's two names for you. And then I think there are other conjectural names as well, but there's at least those two people are real people that were associated with the site.
Well, thanks very much, Scott.
All right. Thank you very much, Scott. Thank you, everyone. And we'll see you next week, right?
On
All right,
Tuesday.
thank you so
Next
much.
week it's on
Tuesday.
Tuesday.
On Tuesday. Right. Take care, everyone. Good evening.